Having looked in our first 3 episodes at modern textiles in shops, at my handloom, in my studio, and at the textile mill itself, we're going to now look at some slides of historic machinery and just explain and place into perspective the entire world of textiles a little more clear in your mind as to what its origins used to be. I brought some slides here, and the first one shows some weavers in Flanders. This is a very ancient form of spinning wheel in the 16th century. And you'll notice that 2 weavers are sitting at the loom, throwing the shuttle back and forth to each other. Traditionally, fabrics are woven about 30 inches wide, and were certainly woven 30 inches, 45 inches wide, which is the normal span of a man's arm weaving as he will through the course of production of a textile. The more complicated a pattern on a textile tends to make it a much narrower textile. So you'll find in certain references fabrics only 18, 24 inches wide. But of course, man has always strived to make things wider and more efficient for their use within society. So hence the adoption of 2 weavers working simultaneously. That still happens today, as a matter of fact. There are some weavers, handloom weavers, as a matter of fact, working in Montreal, who also sit at 100-inch looms, and they throw the shuttle back and forth to each other, and the rhythm of the beat must be very consistent. A note about consistency in the manufacturing of hand-loomed or handmade items is that one mentally begins to sing a song together, a rhythmical song that allows the 2 people sitting next to each other to work in harmony. We have weaving songs that allows the shuttle to throw back at a nice even speed, and they will pull the batten at a regular even speed, and they will change their feet at a regular even speed, so that mentally they are humming a song, the same as a spinner when they're treadling a spinning wheel. They are humming a song that will allow the wheel to be rotated at a very constant level, so that the yarn that's being supplied is, of course, being woven neatly and completely and very fine straight throughout from beginning to end. Here you see a young boy at the back of the loom winding bobbins, because when a couple of weavers were working at a loom, it took a great deal of energy to keep that loom process working at full tilt. We have them working on bobbins in this slide, and of course that would take a lot of energy to keep those 2 weavers occupied. They might go through about 1,000 of those a day. So there's a great deal of energy is involved in the manufacturing of fabrics by hand. This next slide we have is a rather unusual slide. As I mentioned on the program that we went to the mill in Windsor, that I had a slide of a 16th century loom, the first loom for knitting stockings. This is it here. It was invented in the 16th century to make a circular piece of knitting that would ultimately produce a tube of knitted fabric that could be processed into the manufacturing of stockings or the manufacturing of knitted caps that were very, very popular during the 15th and 16th century. And this is the loom that Elizabeth I rejected, and that finally Francis I of France accepted and made it into a manufacturing industry of very high proportions. A very simple structure of wood again, looking very much like the hand weaving loom you saw in my studio, with a front and back. And in actual fact, it is an adaptation of the hand loom itself, only this time being mechanized to allow the thread or the yarn to be spun in the circular motion and creating a knitted fabric. And it's from this machine that we find that the lace-making background for handmade lace today, or machine-made lace, or embroidery machines, or the industrial knitting machine was based on. This is a very simple loom, but certainly very effective. Before stockings were again produced to our present day standards of small, medium, and large, or matching the shoe sizes that we have, they were made in one size. And in this slide, it's taken from Diderot's encyclopedia. It shows the kind of workmanship that goes into making of a stocking in the 18th century. In the background, you will notice people working at various washing areas, washing the stocking after it's been knitted. And you can see them hanging above the 2 washers at the back end of the slide. These are stocking shapes knitted in one cylindrical form, placed onto wooden forms, then scrubbed with soap and hot water, and then hung to dry, and they will shrink now to that peculiar shape. Long stockings, small stockings, different sizes. The shape of the wooden mold was the size that was being required for the use by the public. Nowadays, of course, we cast on stitches for the size of stocking that is required. It minimizes the overall finishing processes towards the end. Here we see 2 people sitting at their bench, carding the stockings, Once the stocking comes off the wooden mold itself, it is brushed with a brush not too unlike the hand cards I showed you carding wool in the second episode. This is to give the overall stocking a kind of fabric look. It wasn't considered to be pleasant or nice at that time during the 18th century to see the ribbing or the knit stitch itself, so they carded the surface and made it look more like fabric. Fabric that was produced in the 18th century was, of course, washed through several processes to shrink it. It may have been woven 36 inches wide, then with several washings would shrink it down to a considerable size for production. Here at the bottom of the slide, you'll see a lot of machinery that was used for the actual production of stocking material, very similar to the kind of machinery used for making fabrics themselves. At the left-hand side, you see some rather strange cylindrical objects. These, in actual fact, are natural thistles specially grown for extra long spines on them. They were then put onto handles, and it was those thistles that would brush the fabric to produce the fabric finish of it. Here we see other shapes being used for the stocking itself. Figure 9, I believe it is, with a wooden leg shape. And the shears, very primitive shears, used to crop the surface of the stocking. So once the fiber was brushed and made woolly, it would then be cropped and made into a nice, clean, finished fabric. We see the cards or the brushes that they were using in the other section of the slide, those rectangular blocks there, and the wash bucket used for washing the fabric. Now, of course, all of that is highly mechanized. But initially, simply a wooden bucket filled with soapy water to wash the stockings in. The bench at the far right was to lay the stockings up for finally sizing the garments on and pressing them into its finished state. That, of course, is just simply the stocking taken from the loom itself and then processed, but it had to be dyed. Sometimes the fashion for red stockings or blue stockings or whatever color was fashionable at the time. As with fabrics, the dyeing process was a separate guild and therefore went through different processes. Here we have a slide showing a very ancient form of dyeing, and when you consider that dyeing, that most of our clothing today is colored, that the actual origin of dyed fabrics was very important. Here we see a large vat being supported over a brazier of heavy coals, usually hardwood at this time during the Middle Ages, and you see two dyers pushing the fabric around in the dye vat to make sure that the natural dye would penetrate the fiber very thoroughly and not make streaks in the cloth. Now, dyeing goes back a very long time. In ancient Egypt and China and in Greece, they used natural earth colors to make a mud from, and the mud was then smeared onto the fabric, and that imparted its coloring agent onto the fabric itself. Of course, we've depended a great deal on natural dyes throughout history. We find that there are 5 major dyes that we take from natural sources. We have indigo that originally grew in India, called Bengal indigo. We have logwood from the bark of the logwood tree. We have walnut hulls that give you a brown dye. We have fustic, which gives a red dye. This being a red dye here is taken from madder root, which is very much like a potato when it's growing, and is mixed with an insect called kermes, which is grown in the Mediterranean, and the kermes beetle is then pulverized in a mortar and pestle, and of course the dye that is extracted from that is used as a coloring agent. Now, in the Middle Ages, because dyes were taken from natural sources, we couldn't always be guaranteed of a clear weather system that would give us enough coloring agent to produce the amount of fabric for that particular season's use. And it was that very reason that caused man during the 19th century to try and find some synthetic way of producing a dye. In about 1861, Samuel Perkins discovered an extract from coal tar that produced the first chemical aniline dyes. And they came out in very brilliant blues and then brilliant magentas. And finally, they extracted from that coal tar dye the full range of colors that are available to us today. It was a major breakthrough for most of society because then dyers and textile manufacturers could anticipate the colors they required for any given season and produce it without consideration for weather conditionings or the fact you couldn't collect in any given good season the plants required for given dyes. So the art of dyeing, although it seems to be a very effete thing to do nowadays with most craftsmen or hand weavers or hand knitters dyeing from natural sources, lichens or onion skins or plant forms, that the actual need to produce a dye consistently it took a very long time to produce. In this next slide, we have a sample of a machine that was used to put a seal of approval on everything. Because when the fabric was being woven, it was then taken to a warehouse, and the warehouse checker would then unfold the entire bolt of fabric and look at it to inspect it for bad weaving or good weaving. And when he was satisfied that the machine was, that the fabric was indeed of top quality, he would then make a seal on this machine. You can see that small space in the center is passing the screen now. And from that would be produced this slide that shows a wax seal, and that wax seal would then be placed onto the fabric, and that was like a registration mark. This is a registration seal from the town of Leyden, excuse me, during the 16th century, and that was a seal of approval indicating that the fabric had indeed been inspected and was worthy of being sold at top market prices. Of course, the entire process of looking at countless bolts of fabric took up an enormous amount of energy, especially when we had market days and fair days where wholesalers would arrive at the market, look at the textiles to be produced, and then buy their fabric. It had to be pre-organized and pre-inspected. These seals simply meant that the manufacturer of this fabric guaranteed quality control. In the 17th century, it was decided that rather than have a seal placed on everything and therefore causing it to be inspected very lengthily, that we would have, or they would have, the king or the aristocrat governing the ownership of the mill at the time grant it a special coloring at the one edge of fabric, the selve edge or the self edge. Nowadays we find on the selvage of fabric small pinstripes of color that are the original trademarks or a guarantee of quality that were established in the 16th and 17th centuries. If perchance a purchaser purchased a bolt of the fabric and it proved to be unworthy or proved to be not consistently from beginning to end and flaws were apparent in it, then they could go back to the king or the aristocrat stating that the registration mark was fraudulent, and that company would then therefore be closed down. It was a serious offense because fabrics, as I mentioned earlier, were a very, very wealthy commodity, and they had to guarantee a certain quality in order to get high prices, and of course it affected everyone. All fabric taken from the looms, of course, goes through this shrinking process that I've mentioned earlier, very much the same as the processes used by the knitting mills in Windsor, Nova Scotia. And in this slide, we will look at some of the processes involved in the 19th century production of textiles. Here we have a spinning room where you find that the spinning wheels are being spun at very high speeds to spin cotton, very much the same as the spinning wheels we saw in Windsor, Nova Scotia. And the man on the left-hand side is indeed going from the beginning to the end, back to front, inspecting each of the wheels that are turning very rapidly to make sure there are no broken ends. The person on the right-hand side, is again doing exactly the same thing, producing massive quantities of spun yarn in preparation for the great needs of the industry during the 19th century. And it was this need, because of the communities and cities becoming larger, built around factory towns, that the need to produce far greater quantities of fabric predicted the development of these extraordinary machines. This entire mill would be operated by a water wheel, and that water wheel would drive a belt that would indeed drive each of the machineries in each of the floors of the factory itself. Here we see a very ancient form of loom in the 19th century again, and you see a man sitting at the front of his loom weaving, and he would have to weave from sunup to sunset, and he was only allowed to weave during the daylight hours. He had to close his shop down at sunset and was not allowed to weave at that point beyond that, unless he was weaving specifically for home consumption, for his family. And that made sure that each person in the row of weavers would indeed be guaranteed that their next door neighbor wasn't going to be earning more money than them or being allowed to work longer hours and therefore lining his pockets, so to speak. So there were heavily restrictions imposed by the guilds to protect each weaver to make sure they produced a set amount of fabric in a set given time. It went from the loom, from the weaver itself, then to the mill to be washed and sized and processed, as we'll see in other slides. This next slide will show you some of the processing used after the fabric comes from the loom, and it's then passed through a series of wooden rollers or metal rollers, and they're passed through at very high speeds. And what in actual fact is happening is the fabric from the loom is put into a degreasing tank the degreasing tank will take out of the wool the natural sheep's grease that was inherent in the wool when it was being spun and woven. The degreasing process then is passed through a wash bath, and the fibers are being shrunk very much tightly together. A fabric woven 54 inches wide would be shrunk down to about 45 inches at times, depending again on the kind of fabric that was being used for. There is still in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, we have what is known as milling frolics. And what it would be a series of weavers who had woven fabric during the winter months getting together in the spring and attaching all their fabrics together, and they would mill this fabric by hand by passing it from hand to hand on a wooden table, very much the same as the action you just saw on that past slide. One of the older members of the community would measure the width of the fabric from selvage to selvage, and she would measure it from the finger to the knuckle, giving what was known as finger lengths. So the width of fabric might be 30 or 40 or 50 finger lengths, and when the fabric was then washed in water and passed around the table by the millers, passing it and beating it, passing it and beating it, singing a milling song, again, to keep the rhythm complete or to keep it consistent for that matter. After a while, the member who measured it with her finger would then stop the milling process, measure it again to see how far it had been shrunk, would cut off a piece that may be lightweight for a suit jacket. It would then be continued in the milling system until you got a piece heavy enough for coat weight, then continued after being cut off, that piece cut off I should say, then continue the milling process until you got blanket weight. So it was a series of doing by hand the same processes that we're now watching in these slides. This next slide shows simply a continuation of the process. Here we see the fabric going through the dye vats, very much like the one we saw at the textile mill in Windsor, only this is being hand operated, and you can see the drive wheel at the side of it that would be driven by a belt and allow the fabric to be pulled around and around several times so that the fabric was being washed and shrunk and dyed and degreased, all in these similar operations. At the slide below that, we notice the fabric is going through the buckling machines, and again the buckling machine is simply a series of wooden rollers that beats the fabric to cause the fibers to shrink together more easily. And this process is again consistent with modern day technology, except that it's now mechanized and is done at high speeds. In the next slide, we see that the fabric is being placed on a stentering frame, and this is simply a frame that has hooks on either side, and that pulls the fabric in its wet state back out to full width, and it will then be placed through drying ovens, and of course that will impart a nice finished sheen onto the finished wool and dry it so the edges are completely straight again and give it a nice wide finish. You want to have the processing, once it's complete through the stentering process, to come back to a nice even edge with a good solid footing. But the machine industry really has developed along the similar lines. All they've done is made it possible now to produce more at a faster pace to fill the needs of society's present requirements. Now, linen, as I mentioned, in Goodman Textiles shop, went through several processes from being a natural brown shade into the dyeing or the bleaching of its natural state and into bleaching fields. In actual fact, during the 18th century, when you went to buy a shirt, for instance, that you couldn't buy in a shop because machine weaving hadn't really extended that far in the 18th century, and you had to have things entirely handmade, the first shop selling mass-produced garments was established in 1770. Up until that time, you went to a flax merchant and bought X pounds of flax, then took it to a spinster, who was not an unmarried lady, but simply a person who spun the yarn. Then it was taken to a weaver who wove the yarn into fabric, then taken to the bleaching fields where it was soaked in sour milk and bleached for 3 or 4 months, and then finally taken to a tailor and made into a shirt. This slide shows some of these processes as they happened in the 16th and 17th century. You find that the large vats are accommodating the linen that is being placed in the vats, and sour milk is being placed on top to allow it to ferment and create a bacteria that will finally eat away some of the natural coloring agent within the linen itself. Here we see several women working in the field, spinning flax and winding flax. The ladies at the back, beside the building, at the back of the slide, are spinning flax from hand distaffs. Now you'll find that the early distaff I showed you in our first series, with the second episode I should say, are spinning with a drop spindle from the flax being held on a large stick. This then moves to the ladies in the foreground, who are winding into skeins in preparation for the actual bleaching or dyeing process. It moves from the winding of the skeins of yarn into the vats that are indeed going to bleach it with the sour milk to cause it to be whitened, or at least to break down the fibers and therefore start the whitening agency. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the development of chlorine, that we simplify this entire process. Once it's taken from these dye vats or these bleaching vats, it is then laid out in fields. And in this next slide, you'll see the fabric laying as it is in fields, mile after mile after mile. And of course, manufacturers would indeed rent these plots of land, seed them with grass, and lay the fabric on the fields. And then it took many men or women, day after day after day for several weeks, sometimes as much as 6 months, throwing waters onto the linen to keep it damp, and therefore causing the oxygen from the grass underneath passing through the linen, that supplemented by the sunlight, began to bleach the linen very, very whitely. In Holland, you'll find lots of land with strange waterways passing through every so many feet of the green land, and that's simply to facilitate the ease of collecting water in buckets and splashing it on the fabric from the ancient days of bleaching fabrics in the bleaching fields. A very lengthy process, so you can see that having a shirt made was not an easy process entirely, and that's why when you had clothing, you didn't just dump it out, you passed it from father to son, finally onto grandchildren, and when it got sufficiently frayed or thin, it would then be cut into strips and woven back into floor carpets or bed sheets, and therefore recycling and recycling constantly. This is why museums find it very difficult to have examples of early clothing. In this last slide here, we see that an ancient technique of ironing the fabric, or at least flattening the fabric from the field, and here we see cannonballs being used to flatten the fabric. Excuse me. As you note, the cannonballs in the center of the fabric, and the ladies are pushing it back and forth, and that way smoothing the fabric and folding it for production in the warehouses to be inspected and therefore being sold. In the ancient days, I shouldn't say ancient days, pre to the 19th century, one didn't use hot irons to flatten linen simply because the heat from the iron tended to break down the cellulose fibers of the fabric and therefore made it break apart and destroy it. Linen was then pressed flat with a long rolling pin, and one rolled the linen flat on a wooden board or a piece of marble, and then it was rolled onto a wooden dowel, and that kept the fabric very flat and very tight. So the entire processing of linen was indeed very complex. So you see, buying fabrics in days prior to the 20th century was not a simple matter. It is probably why we can't find too many examples in museums today of ancient fabrics or ancient garments. Once the fabric went from parent to child and repeated that system time again until finally the fabric wore out, it was then recycled into carpets or into blankets, and of course it's those we find in museums nowadays. So you see, a great deal has happened to the evolution of textiles from the Middle Ages to the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, to the massive mechanization in the 20th century, and our approach and appeal to the fabrics today tends to have a little less understanding unless we can look at it in perspective and appreciate exactly the processes used in days prior to the present time. In our next series in our final episode, in actual fact, we will look at some historic slides of European design, of costumes made during the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, to look at various types of fabrics and the types of surface treatment used during the creation of them. There was one interesting technique developed during the 16th century when they found it very complicated to weave elaborate fabrics with patterns in them. And to simplify the process, they utilized tools developed in Spain for leather workers, producing leather wallpapers in actual fact. And these stamps were then stamped onto the fabric to produce a florid or flowered or patterned textile. And this, of course, gave way to a whole new range of different treatments of textiles. And we'll look at slides showing some examples of those. We will look at slides of the Elizabethan ruff and the quantity of linen being used to dress a 16th, 17th century gentleman or lady into these wide white collars that are known as ruffs during the Elizabethan period. We will also look at some of the fabrics that were part of the inspiration I found for the restoration of Fortress Louisbourg. Some were photographed from the Maurepas collection in America that now house a great collection of Canadian textiles that I copied directly for Fortress Louisbourg. And I believe we have some slides showing the citizens at Louisbourg wearing the costumes. And indeed, the processes will be described as to how I found the garment fabrics, analyzed them in the digs, took them to the hand loom which was designed in Louisbourg, training a young lady who had never woven before into making a warp, dressing a loom, creating the textile in exactly the 18th century fashion. And we had samples, of course, sent to us from Paris of the 18th century so we could copy very accurately this style of fabric. Then we'll see some designs done from my research in Paris based on 18th century originals in museums or galleries or coats of arms above buildings, as a matter of fact, and where I got the inspiration for these garments. We'll also see some of the uniforms that were designed and the fabrics that were created based on samples of fabrics found from the Military Museum in Paris, very generously given to us by Marcel Baldet in Paris at the time, and how we copied these fabrics exactly, and how we had imported from Europe the gold braids, the silks, and the various trimmings, and I will describe how these costumes are made. And I think maybe have you understand the extraordinary range of present-day activities in restoration. There are many restorations happening across Canada that were built primarily after the Fortress of Louisbourg restoration in 1970-71 it began, in at least the costume end of it was. Now we have many fortresses across Canada, as we have in the States as well, trying to reproduce the period of the original fort itself or the original homestead area, and we're now having them animated by persons sitting in these buildings wearing costumes of the period, so that one's understanding of costumes is becoming much more acute, one's appreciation for textiles becoming much more refined in this present decade. So until next week and our final episode, thank you very much.